Welcome everyone to another segment of Wednesdays with Wendy. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Wendy Garvin Mayo. I'm the founder of Shape Partners. I am so excited tonight because we have a special guest. Dr. Maggie Smith is here with us to talk to us about clinical trials. I will let you in a little secret. Maggie Smith is one of my really good friends and mentors. I really look up to her. So I'm really excited about having her on tonight to talk about clinical trials. So now I'll pass it over to Maggie just to do a brief introduction of herself so you guys can get to know a little bit about her.
Thank you, Wendy, for having me tonight. As Wendy stated, she is one of my very good friends, and I certainly look up to her as well. I am an associate director for a pharmaceutical company. I manage a team of medical science liaisons that cover the country, and their primary role is to do like proactive and reactive types of communications, et cetera, in regards to science, related to the company's products, as well as primary responsibility is to be the liaisons or the gatekeepers for investigator-initiated clinical trials, so research studies. So that's a lot of the work that my team actually does, and I will soon be expanding my role to cover the Canadian MSL team and leading that team up as well.
Awesome. That's really cool. Really cool. So Maggie, I want to start off very basic for our audience. So what are clinical trials and why do you think they are important in the oncology space specifically?
So clinical trials are research studies. So most people look at research, or some people look at research as being a guinea pig, but um, this is just how our basic Tylenol and things that we see on the shelves when we go to our local pharmacies, how they get there is through the clinical trial process. So clinical trials are very important to help address unmet needs to advance a variety of different diseases. So oncology is my world. And as you know, we don't have a cure for a lot or any of these cancers as of yet. And the purpose of clinical trials is to hopefully improve patient outcomes in terms of overall survival and help with their response rates and delay the intervals to the next treatment, and also hopefully to have patients have a much better quality of life dealing with what I like to look at cancer as a chronic condition.
Yeah, so that's a great answer. And you said something very key, guinea pigs, because I think many times people think of clinical trials as, them being the guinea pig, or in this setting, their loved ones being a guinea pig.
Yeah, which is so unfortunate. I actually.
What? Oh, I think we're back.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I can hear you now. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So you were asking, what do I think about?
So individuals, that you said are guinea pigs. And I think that is something that many people do think, right? They don't want to be a guinea pig, or in this setting, their loved one being a guinea pig when it comes to clinical trials. So what are the processes to ensure that subjects or patients enrolled in clinical trials are not guinea pigs?
They should be informed. So as you know, a couple years ago, the roles were reversed for me. So my dad was diagnosed with cancer, and I had to now become his caregiver and his advocate. So that was like a tough situation. So I'm used to being on the other side as the person that would typically advise a patient, like, you do have options. A clinical trial is one of those options. So for me, my dad was one of those individuals that felt like research is just about him being a guinea pig, and he didn't want to be someone's like lab rat. But I had to actually help him to make an informed decision by one, breaking down what are the advantages of being in a clinical trial, and then two, just explaining to him that he still has the opportunity to receive standard of care. But because his cancer was so advanced at the time of his diagnosis, he had a better chance of getting an experimental drug that will potentially help him. But as a patient, as a clinician, as a daughter, always do your homework, always do your research to see what options are out there and what's best for you, for your family, for your friend, or whomever is the patient who is being offered a clinical trial. So there are advantages.
Yes, no, definitely. And I want to talk about those advantages. But you said something, standard of care. What's the difference between standard of care and clinical trials? Just for our,
So, sure. So, standard of care are just the options that have already gone through that process of being researched. This is what every patient who will come through the door who will receive. So, there's no difference in terms of the treatments that options that you are going to actually receive. So, if someone comes in with a diagnosis of whatever, and the standard of care may be, I'll just use something basic like Tylenol, then that will be that option for that patient to receive. But the advantage, as I stated, of a clinical trial is just having that opportunity to participate in science that it may not necessarily help you at that particular time, depending on where you are in terms of your diagnosis, but it can help the future. So advanced medicine, advanced science for the future.
okay, no, good. I think we're having some connection issues, but thank you for that. And you mentioned at the tail end of your last response that there's some advantages to clinical trials.
Yeah.
What would those advantages be in particular? I know
So
you were saying, go ahead.
no, I was just, highlighting the fact that all of the research for clinical trials may not necessarily help the patients that are actually receiving the drug. Just depending on where they are in terms of their diagnosis or their stage of their disease, but it certainly can help the future. So it helps to address those, questions that we need to continue to have answers to in regards to that specific disease. Or that treatment option for patients.
Yeah, and many of the caregivers I talk to, when you think of clinical trials, you think that that's the end, right? So there are no other options in terms of standard of care. Do you believe that to be true? Like once the doctor starts talking about clinical trials, that there is no more standard of care interventions that can be implemented?
No, I don't see that to be the case. I just see clinical trials as an option, another toolbox or a resource to have as a clinician, or to offer to patients to continue, as I stated, to address those unmet clinical needs.
Yeah. And as caregivers, which we do have a lot of cancer caregivers watching, should they be inquiring about clinical trials proactively
Absolutely,
or
absolutely.
Mhm.
I would say yes, if that's something that is of interest to them, to certainly ask questions. I think as a caregiver, you should also be informed and involved in the process of your loved one who is undergoing treatment. And you just need to make sure that you are educated. Most clinical trials, once they are approved on clinicaltrials.gov, so you can go in and do a search to see what's available for your specific tumor type or your disease, to see what you can potentially qualify for, and if there are clinical trials closer to home. For you to, decrease the travel time to academic institutions, et cetera.
Okay, no, that's good. And I think, it's really important when we're talking about clinical trials, just in, the time and day that we're in now, talking about the health disparities. I know you do some work in regards to health disparities. Can you speak a little bit on health disparities in clinical trials?
Yeah, that's an area that I'm very, very passionate about in terms of just addressing the disparities that we see, especially in minority populations. I think a lot of the stigma stems from the Tuskegee experiment, and a lot of minorities associate clinical trials with that very much so. And what happened, it was very real. But things now have certainly changed in terms of where how research is regulated to make sure that there is a fair balance and decreasing biases and things of that nature. But it's important that people of color see other people of color in healthcare settings as their care provider, as well as just as support. So, different support groups as well, so that they can continue to support each other and educate each other in regards to the advancements that have been made. Um, Going out in the community is something that I always do. I'm a firm believer in that, just to continue to educate minority populations in regards to the importance of clinical trials, because the only way to actually know how these drugs actually work in minority patients, how they affect our genetic makeup, etc., we need to have a seat at the table to be involved in various clinical trials. And I think we're going to see that a lot more with the advancements that have been made to ensure that minority patients are included in some of these COVID clinical trials as well.
Yes, no, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I think, the biggest, most important thing you said was that education piece. And you said clinicaltrials.gov is a resource, but if a caregiver is at an institution, who would be that go-to person to really explore the option for clinical trials for their loved ones? Would it be the doctor? Would it be the nurse? Do they have research nurses? Who would that be?
Yeah, yeah. That's, I mean, most institutions, academic institutions, do have research nurses that are the key point of contact. But at some institutions, they also have clinical research coordinators. Also, at the institutions, you have the oncology nurse navigators, or the navigators, which can be lay navigators that help you navigate throughout the trajectory of your cancer diagnosis. So you have to seek out either of those individuals as well as the physician. Usually they definitely have to be involved in terms of consenting patients, et cetera. But those are some of the other very key players that play a very important role in terms of having the knowledge about clinical trials and what will be best to offer patients.
Okay, no, that's good. And I know some clinical trials, patients are randomized, whether it's placebo or the actual drug. If that's a real concern for people, what would your advice be to them?
Just usually when you have a clinical trial and it is standard of care, which I just gave an explanation of, versus placebo, that's just typical. That's more or less phase 3 type of study. So earlier clinical trials, they usually do not use a placebo because they want to make sure that whatever the comparator is something that's going to be effective. But phase 3, when the placebo is actually used, that means that there's no other drug that's been FDA approved that has shown to be effective against this specific type of cancer. So that's when the placebo is actually implemented into a clinical trial. But it will not be implemented if there is another drug, treatment of choice that is considered standard of care.
Yeah, and that's the ethics of it too. So
Yeah,
making sure that you understand that when you're sitting down to talk about enrolling your loved one into a clinical trial. So,
right.
but I think we have some questions in the chat, Maggie. I'm gonna pull them up here. Lynn, some patients like the fact that they may be helping others down the line. Yes, very true. We have a question from Joanne Smith-Bannock. Do you feel that patients of disparities do not get the same options as others, or do they have that guinea pig feeling that you refer to? I'm aware that the Tuskegee trials that still impact people today. I would love your perspectives.
You
Maggie, can you?
know, yeah, yeah. So sometimes, I mean, this is one of the factors that has been certainly researched in regards to clinician bias. That's still something that's very real in regards to clinicians having a perspective that this particular patient may not, do well in this clinical trial because they may not be compliant or they may not adhere to the regimen. So that is certainly a well-known factor that has attributed to the disparities that we see with minority patients not even being offered to participate in a clinical trial. I think more work needs to continue to be done by the FDA to address the percentage of minority patients being enrolled in clinical trials, especially larger clinical trials that actually where the incidence of the disease has a much higher prevalence rate amongst minority populations.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point about healthcare professionals, their bias of not offering, right, the
Yeah,
clinical trial because of their preconceived notions. So that is really real. But I think that's the importance of really being educated, right?
yeah,
Being a caregiver who's educated, educating your loved one as to what is available to them. So then you can bring that to your provider. But
yeah,
on top of that, it's that trust, right? So really having trust with the physician who's treating your loved one and being an active participant of the team. And that's what, we really preach here is that caregivers are an essential part of that team. And you are there to educate, ask questions, and make sure you have a full understanding of what's going on and the options for your loved ones.
yeah.
So
Very true.
that's very, very, very important. Um, Okay, no, this is really good. If you have any other questions, please put them in the chat. Thank you for that question, Joanne. And we're coming to the tail end of this. Do you have any last pearls or advice for our caregivers in terms of clinical trials?
The probably one piece of advice that I can give is just to continue to educate yourselves. Don't shy away from conducting your own research. I know people tend to say like, Google doesn't make you an expert. It doesn't, but clinicaltrials.gov is certainly a great resource if you are looking for clinical trials that are available in your state or your area based upon your loved one's diagnosis to kind of see what's out there. It's nothing wrong with coming to the appointment with your list of questions to be prepared to ask. Like, what are some of the options if this clinical trial is the best option for my loved one? But just do your due diligence in terms of continuing to educate yourselves in regards to what the clinical trial entails in terms of the differences between phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, what the terms randomized actually means, and placebo, as we just talked about a little bit. Things of that nature. Just make sure that it's the right fit for you. And as well as when you do agree to sign up for that clinical trial, you and your loved one, it is a commitment. It's important that you continue to participate in the clinical trial so that we can actually see as clinicians like how this drug or whatever it is actually works and if it truly is effective.
And
So
I
those
will
are
just
probably,
ask questions. Don't ever feel like you're forced to sign on the dotted line, or if you sign, you can't like change your mind. Like you're
yep.
locked in. So definitely ask questions. And here at Shape Partners, if you have any questions regarding clinical trials, you can definitely reach out. We'll definitely help explain what it is, get you to the right websites, get you the information you need for your appointment. So we are more than happy to provide that service for you. And if there are no more questions, we're going to wrap up. Maggie, this was so good. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank
Um,
you.
I think that's it for tonight.
All right.
Everyone, have a good night.
Have a good night.